He's been very instrumental over the past several years in moving the partnership forward. We're pleased to have him with us at the symposium. Actually, we're extremely happy and excited to have him at the symposium because Kim's been through some issues with his health in the last while, so it's great to see him here. Kim's a hard guy to keep up with, and he's a hard guy to follow. That's why I went first.
Now I have to lower the mic, John. I will resist the temptation to add comments to you now. But it is indeed my pleasure, and actually, Bob, and it's an honor and a privilege to introduce you. And so I'm going to have a combination of what Bob would like us to say about him versus what I want to say about Bob. Right, Bob?
Yeah, right.
This is the fourth year in a row that Bob and I have shared a platform. I really want to emphasize the fact that with Bob Sandford being here, it really is quite significant because he does represent the United Nations. And so in that sense, it's very real to say that, that the United Nations is not only here participating, the United Nations is an observer, and there are people back east who are asking Bob, why are you in Nanaimo? Why were you in Courtney last year? Why were you in Richmond the year before, right? In Kelowna last year, right? So seeing all the small towns in British Columbia, but that's where the action is, right? That's going to be your line, anyway. So it is a pleasure to have Bob, and in terms of okay, I'll go to the script, right? Which is that Bob's been working on UN-related or UN-linked initiatives on water and mountain regions for nearly 20 years. I think most significantly is your position as the EPCOR Chair for Water and Climate Security at the United Nations University Institute for Water, the Environment and Health, and that's a program of universities around the world, and for Canada, it's based at McMaster, correct? And I guess we've got the water group and you. And in his work with the Institute, Bob was the co-author of the 2015 United Nations report entitled Water in the World We Want, which in part laid the foundation for the UN's 2030 Sustainable Development Goals with respect to water. And Bob, you're working on Labrador 2030, aren't you? Good man. And I think of particular interest to British Columbians is Bob is also the author or editor of some 30 books on the natural history of Canada's Mountain West, because you're from Alberta, right? So the Rockies. And notably, he's co-authored 2 books with John Reid, the former Deputy Minister of Environment in British Columbia, The Climate Nexus and The Hard Work of Hope. So Bob is not only is a water guy, but he's a prolific writer. And in 2017, Bob also published a life work, because your passion is glaciers, right? You're going to get right down to the state of scientific understanding of the Cryosphere in Canada and around the world. The book is entitled Our Vanishing Glaciers, the Snows of Yesteryear and Future Climate of the Mountain West. And not only is Bob working in Canada, but around the world. And in fact, I guess maybe your theme today is that the way things have gone the last few years in the States, there's even more reason to be active in Canada to show an alternative, right? So on that note, I've gone through your busy life travel. Bob, coming up here, right? Do your thing.
Thank you. Well, first, thank you very much, Kim, not just for the invitation, but for the kind introduction. And I, too, would like to say that it's really good to see you here and recovering. It's an honor, I should say, to be here. And Kim was joking that people ask me, well, why are you in Nanaimo? And I tell the UN it's because in places like this is where it's happening. So I think it's really true also. But it is an honor to be here and a privilege to extend the very best wishes of the United Nations to all British Columbians. And my topic tonight is the hard work of hope for now and for the future in a time of unprecedented global change. On March 22nd, the United Nations celebrated the 25th anniversary of World Water Day. And on this day of each year, the United Nations focuses the attention of the world on the importance of water. And the theme for World Water Day this year was nature for water. Notice that it isn't water for nature, but nature for water. And I'd like to explain why that distinction is so important and how it can inspire hope here and elsewhere. So let's start at the global level and work our way back down to Canada and then to British Columbia. And what we're seeing globally is that a strongly entrenched narrative within our society that has pictured humanity as being somehow above global material and energy cycles with no need to consider the finiteness of the Earth's resources. That worldview has proven to be wrong and dangerous. And as a society, we have to come back down to Earth. And that process, as you know here, is well underway. And as you'll see tomorrow, there's really strong aspirations to move in that direction here. But generally, and certainly globally, progress has been haltingly slow. And one of the great obstacles appears to be our own human nature. Social scientists and big data analytics tell us, so many words actually, that if you want to influence human behavior, facts don't matter. Forget the science and stop scaring people. Concentrate instead on appealing to human instincts, personal identity, preferences, loyalties, and self-interest. And rather than appealing to rational thinking at a time of growing global Earth system crises, we were repeatedly told that the only way to strategically influence the popular public imagination is through more specifically targeted messaging based on what big data tells us about how individual and group profiles what they do in terms of related to behavior. And we're told that there are really 5 fundamental instincts that appear in every culture and that are all tied to survival. And the first is the instinct to nurture children and vulnerable people. The second, a strong demand for fairness and reciprocity. The third, loyalty to one's group of origin, which includes family, ethnicity, and nationality. The fourth, the desire to be able to move upward in one's social hierarchy. And finally, an instinct to form groups of purity defined by adherence to strict moral codes in circles in which one belongs and wants to belong. And social scientists and big data analysts tell us that these 5 instincts can now be measured in every culture, and that they know how to tap deep biological and often non-rational instincts through carefully constructed forms of communication through social and other media. And they claim that if you know how these 5 instincts drive people, you can engage them more effectively right down to the level of the individual. By identifying latent markers such as the music you like or the charities you support, you can predict people's behavior with or without their permission or them even knowing. And more than that, if the story you can tell them can engage them at the level of their deepest instincts, you can move people beyond persuasion. We were also told that the goal of big data analytics is to map the entire world and to identify the differences in biological markers sufficiently to allow more effective communication and the changing of minds globally. But when then those who would wish to make the world a better place turn to big data and related breakthroughs in deeper communication in support of common understanding of issues such as water and water-related climate concerns, we find that we have arrived too late. The space has already been hijacked by the inevitable forces of power and greed. The public mind is already being heavily manipulated toward other ends, and get in line. That is why political populism is on the rise in the world, why to some extent Brexit happened, and why the US elected Donald Trump. And this is also why there has been a widespread resurgence of carefully orchestrated climate denial, why it's also then possible to sell a lot more pickup trucks, and in part why instead of remaining flat, as they have for the last 3 years, energy-related carbon dioxide emissions globally did not go down as signatories to the Paris Accord had hoped, but in 2017 rose to the highest levels in history. So this is very interesting, because Kim was giving me a bad time about when I was born. Can you imagine? Well, I was born in 1949, and at birth, there was a concentration, and I'm referring to the Keeling curve in the middle here, the graph of carbon dioxide rising. At birth, the concentration of the Earth's atmosphere of carbon dioxide was about 300 parts per million. By the time I was 20, it was 320 parts. By the time I was 30, it was 330. By the time I was 40, it was 350 parts per million. When I turned 50, it was 375 parts per million. When I turned 60, it was 390 parts per million. And last Sunday, it was close to 410. So what I'm telling you is that in one short lifetime, the concentration of one of the most critical greenhouse gases in the Earth's fragile atmosphere has risen in concentration by 35%. So to say that we're not adequately dealing with this is an understatement. And this is quite interesting, because I think that for many people who study this, especially the climate scientists with whom I work and the networks and which they are working in also, we have to struggle sometimes to realize that it takes hard work to have legitimate hope, to have true hope, to have meaningful hope in what we might see in the future and how we might affect that. And I can tell you that if you work on a global scale, what's happening right now is nothing short of a nightmare. It's not so much of a sci-fi nightmare as a cli-fi nightmare. And a variation of which that many of us we've discovered have when you fall asleep. And we were actually laughing about this last week. The nightmare always seems to start in the same way. And it's a way I think many of us are becoming used to, in that we wake up in the morning in the dream to a Twitter message. And I wonder where that comes from. And the Twitter message is from society to which you once felt belong, but something's gone terribly wrong. And we were laughing about this. The worst nightmare yet was the one in which the message said, "Don't bother with doubts in the future. Be in touch with your inner locust." Yes, your inner locust, and it will tell you this abundance will never end. And the dream invariably goes to hell from there. You wake up screaming, covered in big flying insects, and don't worry, I'm getting help for this. So we appear to be back where we started. If you want to have realistic hope for the future, facts do in fact matter, and so does science. And it matters because it is from the science that we derive the urgency for meaningful action. So what's science saying? So let's start with what we're learning about our planet. In what is now being heralded as the Second Copernican Revolution, Earth scientists have discovered that our self-regulating planetary life support system is not just a collection of individual ecosystems as we once thought. The view that the planet needs to be understood as a unified, complex, evolving, biodiversity-based system has led in turn to three linked breakthroughs in Earth system science. And the first is the concept of the Anthropocene, which suggests we have entered a new geological epoch defined by human influence on Earth system function. And the concept of the Anthropocene poses some of the most interesting challenges and questions of our time. Should we accept the fact that we have irreversibly changed the world and that now we have to run the show? Or should we do everything we can to return to conditions we have known in the past? And this leads to the question, well, do you have a choice after you go past a certain threshold? And there's more at stake here than we know, or that the breathless predictions of techno-futurists and other prognosticators reveal. It's important to understand that in taking the Anthropocene gamble, there's no going back. Such a decision would be irreversible. In giving up on protecting biodiversity, Earth system, planetary life support function, there's no going home again. We'll have to be responsible for and replace elements of Earth system function we have lost and are losing. And the fact at the moment is that even if we knew how to do that, there isn't enough money in the world to artificially replace the services that nature provides for us for free now. To claim that we could actually artificially replace these services is absurd. In many cases, we still don't even know what natural services we rely upon or how they work until we've already lost them. And right now the world is too damaged to sustain us, and if we want life as we know it on this planet to remain possible and worthwhile in the future, we have to restore the damage that we're doing to natural systems. We have to restore the world so the world can restore us to hope. The second of the three linked breakthroughs in Earth system science is the concept of the Great Acceleration, the extraordinary increase in human impacts on biodiversity-based Earth system function since the end of the Second World War. And it's in that brief period, the period in which all of us have lived, that we have seen the most rapid transformations of the human relationship with the natural world in the entire history of humankind. The third of the three linked breakthroughs in Earth system science is the concept of planetary boundaries, limits within which we need to stay if we are to create a safe operating place for humanity so that we can continue to assure the stability of the planetary conditions we can live within now and endure in the future. So notice in this that water security is only one of the Earth system boundaries that mark the safe zone that we must stay within if we want a prosperous future. And so is climate stability. But note also that other human-induced impacts occurring in tandem with climate disruption are important also. These impacts include alterations of the global nitrogen and phosphorus cycles, ocean acidification, and synthetic chemical pollution, all of which clearly are near tipping points that could push the Earth and conditions that support life on Earth into new and unrecognizable states. And of the 9 critical Earth system boundaries, we've already crossed 4. And when we look at all the boundaries together, we begin to get a picture of how intricately water and climate are linked to all of these boundaries. You might even say that water security and climate stability are the same thing. So let's look at what science is saying now about hydroclimatic change in the context of changes that are occurring within the larger global system. My work is to translate complex scientific research outcomes with respect to water and climate into language the average person can understand and that decision makers can use to craft timely and durable policy. And it's this work, and in this work, the most important thing that I have learned is that if you want to understand climate change, follow the water. The reasoning behind this proposal is very simple. Liquid water, snow and ice respond directly, visibly, and measurably to temperature. If we follow what's happening to our water, it will tell us what's happening to our climate and to our world. And if we follow this, all you have to do to find evidence that this is so is to turn on the late night news any night you want. According to a United Nations report, there was a near doubling of weather-related disasters globally between 1995 and 2015. The 6,457 floods, storms, droughts, and other related events over those 2 decades caused 90% of disasters worldwide. And these disasters have claimed more than 600,000 lives and caused more than $1.9 trillion in direct damage and incalculable human suffering. So now let's look at the changes that are occurring in hydroclimatic regimes that are affecting us here in Canada, and particularly in British Columbia. And I have to say, and perhaps some of you witness this also, that keeping up with breakthroughs in water and water-related climate science lately has been like trying to drink from a fire hose. Even before climate became an issue, we'd already begun altering the global hydrologic cycle through rapid and expansive alteration of land use and cover. More than half the entire surface of the planet has been significantly altered by human activities with enormous, noticeable, and measurable impacts on water. Land use and cover changes, however, are only the beginning of the effects human activities are having on the global hydrologic cycle. Our entire earthly reality is defined by all the ways in which water reacts with nearly every element in the physical world. So if you change a few parameters that pertain to water, and the world you see out your window becomes a different place. And some parameters, however, have more influence than others over the nature and function of any given hydroclimatic circumstance. The changing of a single defining parameter, temperature, for example, changes all of the other biogeochemical parameters related to water and life. And if our global temperature changes, an entire new geometry is created around that change. And the most interesting discovery of this young century is that's exactly what's happening. The rate and manner in which water moves through the global hydrologic cycle is accelerating. It's happening right before our eyes, here and everywhere. And in every presentation I give, I remind people that the most profound changes to the hydrologic cycle relate to how much more water a warmer atmosphere can hold. We have known for more than a century that for every degree Celsius of warming, we can expect the atmosphere to carry 7% more water vapor. So if you increase the temperature of the atmosphere by 2 degrees Celsius, the atmosphere can carry as much as 14% more water vapor. And if you raise the temperature of the atmosphere by 4 degrees, then that atmosphere will carry 28% more water vapor, which changes everything. So more water vapor in the atmosphere is making storms more powerful, heat waves more intense, and drought deeper and more persistent here in British Columbia. And what should demand our full attention at the moment is the extraordinarily powerful nature of the genie we have unwittingly released from the atmospheric bottle. Some 52 million cubic kilometers of water move through the global hydrologic cycle at any given moment. And it's estimated that 10 trillion tons of water are shifted from one hemisphere to the other in the form of winter snow cover in only one annual seasonal cycle. And what we're discovering is that because of the warming, the ratio of snow to liquid water and the great seasonal redistribution of precipitation in the northern hemisphere is changing, with huge potential consequences for us all. And nowhere is this more true than in the Canadian West. And as I've reported, research conducted by the Western Canadian Cryospheric Network has demonstrated that we lost some 300 glaciers in the Mountain National Parks region of the Rockies alone in the 85 years between 1920 and 2005. And this loss is expected to continue, with over 90% of the ice in the interior ranges of British Columbia expected to be gone by the end of this century. And it should be noted that this is not just the loss of ice, that there are greater dimensions to this. The same warming that is causing our glaciers to disappear so quickly is reducing snowpack and the duration and extent of snow cover in the Mountain West. And what we're seeing, and you've seen this in the last 3 years, I'm sure some of you personally observed this, summer temperatures, what you're getting here is that the summer temperatures are eating away at even normal and above normal snowpacks and snow cover, and glaciers continue to recede even after what were once typically normal winters. And what we're seeing is snowpack and snow cover continue to decline in the Mountain West by 17% per decade. So if your your lifestyle, your business is connected in any way to this, you may want to pay attention. And the other thing you may have noticed is that something is happening to the Northern Hemisphere jet stream. Put simply, the Northern Hemisphere jet stream, or what's often called the polar jet stream, are the westerly winds that are created as the world spins inside the torn blanket of its own atmosphere. You'll observe, I'm sure, that the jet stream is not a straight line, but curves around in great, elegant meanders. And the first sign that something important was changing was that the increase that we have been witnessing in the last recent years in the waviness of the jet stream, and it's begun to bring cold Arctic air to ever lower latitudes than in the past. And this is really interesting because people say to me all the time, well, how can there be climate change when our winters are so damn cold? Well, here's what's happening. In addition to being larger in amplitude, the meanders of the jet stream move eastward more slowly, causing weather patterns to move more slowly also. And it's these more persistent weather patterns that result in the intensification we are witnessing of events in which duration is an important factor, such as droughts, flooding, heat waves, and cold spells. And again, for evidence that this is happening all year round, all you have to do is turn on the news. We see from altered behavior of the jet stream that warmer atmospheric temperatures do not automatically translate into warmer weather. In a uniformly warmer and therefore more turbulent atmosphere, both warm and cold fronts end up and persist in places in the mid-latitudes in which they were not common in the past. And they oscillate, which is really interesting, sometimes with very serious effects. And we're seeing this kind of disruption now, right now, in real time here in British Columbia. And it's already impacted attendance at this symposium. Zoe Kirk, who is the Public Works Projects Coordinator for the Regional District of Okanagan-Similkameen, had planned to come to tomorrow's symposium. She had to cancel at the last moment to be close to home as they were already experiencing flooding. And an extreme weather event on the evening of March 22nd dropped a month's normal rainfall in 24 hours. This overwhelmed culverts, which in turn created localized flooding accompanied by rock slides and debris flows, things you know all about. A privately owned dam also filled to capacity and began seeping, which puts residents of a nearby community in harm's way. The heavy rainfall event underscored the fact that the soils were saturated going into winter, and that, as feared, sinks that normally absorbed excess runoff were already full. And of greater immediate concern was the surrounding snowpack, which is 150% of normal, and that is yet to start melting. And I also talked to Nelson Yatel in the Okanagan Basin, and he said they are experiencing exactly the same thing. Now, Zoe's regional district is in the process of setting up a semi-permanent emergency operations center that will function until the fall. And as information officer for the emergency operations center, Zoe organized a media lunch, and you can see the cake there. And she organized that to thank them for their work and to prepare them for what they are likely to expect to come this summer. And the reason for doing this is that in addition to these hydrologic problems, the fire season has already begun in adjacent districts. And it's important to respect the fact that there is a direct climatic connection between water and its diametric and symbolic opposite, fire. So if you don't have one, then you get the other. Higher mean temperatures, especially in northern Canada, are already resulting in increased wildfire risk. And based on carbon dioxide increases alone, scientists predict a whopping 75 to 120% increase in the area burned each year by the end of the century. So what you're seeing again is this slower, wavier jet stream is causing conditions that exacerbate wildfire and also brings that wildfire threat to persist longer in vulnerable places. And so what is happening, and this is measurable, fires are already becoming bigger, hotter, and faster. And no Hollywood movie could even come close to depicting what bigger, hotter, faster fires meant in and around Fort McMurray in 2016. But you here saw the same conditions come into existence last year when the jet stream parked a huge high pressure system over the west for months. And at one point, it seemed to me watching from elsewhere that the entire province of British Columbia had caught fire. And in August, 19 fires joined to create the largest single fire in your province's history. We're also learning a great deal about the lingering effects of drought from the fires in California. Extended drought weakens trees, making them more vulnerable to wildfire. And it's been estimated that as many as 120 million trees died in California during the recent drought. These dead trees fueled horrific fires that threatened cities as big as Los Angeles. But the effects did not end, and this is what's interesting about deciding when droughts end, because the effects did not end when the rains finally arrived to end the drought. The rains fell over vast areas in which fires had been so hot they baked the soil, making it impervious to water. And unable to penetrate the soil, heavy rainfall mobilized tons of ash and burnt debris before flooding affected downstream areas with massive mudslides. So you can expect that here. Now, where I'd like to conclude this observation on Canada is in the Arctic. And this is, I think, the most interesting part of it. The Arctic is already 3.5 degrees Celsius above the global average in terms of temperature. So keeping that region below 2 degrees Celsius of warming as per the Paris Accord is no longer possible. And moreover, the situation appears to be accelerating. While we were obsessing over the US election and the reality show drama that followed in its wake, alarms were going off all over the Arctic. On November 17, 2016, temperatures over the North Pole and the Arctic Ocean were 20 degrees Celsius above normal, and sea ice formation was lower than at any point since researchers began keeping records. But in February of this year, temperatures over the pole were 35 degrees Celsius above normal. And the question got asked, well, where's the Arctic cold? Well, it's being shunted to the mid-latitudes. And climate scientists fear that this prolonged and persistent warming of the Arctic may mean the climate problem is accelerating faster than we had imagined. Arctic snow cover is declining at 22% per decade. Arctic ice has been declining at a rate of 12% per decade. But something else has just started to happen. Multi-year ice is disappearing, and not as much sea ice is reforming. Now, there's two linked concerns here. The first is the impact of the loss of Arctic sea ice on weather patterns at mid-latitudes where we live, and the second being the potential for spontaneous release of methane presently entombed by Arctic cold into the atmosphere. So let me explain. The first troubling discovery we made in the Arctic concerns the link between the behavior of the Northern Hemisphere jet stream and the amount of sea ice there is in the Arctic. So warming temperatures are leading to more sea ice loss, which in turn makes the jet stream even wavier, which brings even more warm air into the Arctic, which leads to more sea ice loss, creating a feedback that goes on and on. The Arctic is now warming 5 to 8 times faster than the equatorial region. And as a consequence, there's also the related threat posed by natural methane and perhaps mercury releases from the warming land into the air and into inland and coastal waters. Now this is really interesting. This is Katie Walters at the University of Alaska. And on the right you can see the methane bubbles coming up under the ice. And it gives you an idea of just how much methane there is coming up out of those Arctic lakes. And Katie Walters took a chisel, because she wanted to know the volume of this, and she had a lighter. As soon as the gas started coming out of the lake ice, she struck it, and I kind of thought, well, that's, it's going to be like this. Well, the flame was 15 feet high, which gives you an idea of the kinds of things that are happening there. And so what we have to say here is that as a consequence, there's also the related threat posed by these methane and mercury releases. And this is interesting because as the Arctic Ocean warms, frozen marine sediments that contain methane hydrates and clathrates are also thawing, producing methane gas that's begun to rise to the surface in these huge bubble plumes, which can have a greenhouse effect that can be 100 to 200 times greater than that of carbon dioxide. And alarmingly, the overall combination of ice loss and the loss of snow in the northern hemisphere may contribute an additional 50% to the direct global heating effect caused by the addition of carbon dioxide to the atmosphere. So the question you got to ask, well, why aren't we doing anything about that? Well, the first thing, and I think it's really important to understand this, relates to the scientific method. Scientists do not make rash judgments. They're especially loath to fall into a trap called pareidolia. Pareidolia is the human tendency to look at a random image and see a pattern where none exists. And the rapid retreat of northern hemisphere sea ice and the amplification of Arctic warming have all occurred in only the last 10 years. And 10 years is not enough time to distinguish the effect of changes in the Arctic system from other random events in the context of what's happening to the global climate generally. So what I'm saying here is that at the moment, at least in the Arctic, climate disruption is moving faster than science can keep up. And there's evidence that total Arctic sea ice could have an irreversible effect on the stability of the entire northern hemisphere climate system. And we could be approaching that within a few years, but we don't know. We wish we knew, but we don't know. And it's likely we won't know where the tipping point actually was until after we cross it. We just don't know. But here's what we do know. Climate disruption will likely accelerate, and we need to anticipate, monitor, and model these changes better than we do now. We need to use all the help that nature can provide us to sustain what we have, to slow and moderate the effects of climate change, to give us time to adapt, and to give other species in our self-regulating, biodiversity-based Earth system the time and space they need to evolve with us in response to the new planetary conditions that are emerging. And to do that, we need to commit to careful, ongoing ecological restoration in the midst of accelerating climate disruption. So we need to better understand the effects that continuous and ongoing weather disruption will also have on human and physical and mental health, and on the behavior of other species upon which we depend for our survival and for our stability. If we believe, for example, in preventative medicine for ourselves and for the rest of life, then there is a really strong argument in favor of ecological restoration as an urgent societal priority. In fact, our prosperity depends on managing these kinds of changes. And that is why tomorrow's symposium is so important. And having this conference here is a reason for hope, because it's not the end of the world. We're actually getting somewhere here and globally. And what we're seeing is the worldview is changing. At the UN, we believe we need a new narrative, one that includes respect for the rest of the life we share our planet with, and whose presence we rely upon for the stability of the Earth system, which makes our presence possible. And as part of this new narrative, we also need to create a new sense of time that extends forward to include future generations. We need every UN member state to help create that narrative at both national and subnational levels. And that's why what you're doing here matters. In responding to the urgency and opportunity of finally getting sustainability right, the United Nations has created a new framework for global action. The 2030 Transforming Our World Sustainable Development Agenda is nothing less than a charter for people on the planet in the 21st century. And while it didn't receive the same attention in the media, the announcement of this agenda was at least as important as later climate negotiations in Paris, because it deals with damage we're doing to other elements of the Earth system that are exacerbating and being exacerbated by climate change. Now, we also know that fulfilling this agenda is not going to be easy. And in World Water Week, that week invited us to think about how we're going to manage droughts, floods, and water pollution, and how we can slow and moderate the effects of climate disruption by using solutions we already find in nature. And in Canada, we're slowly beginning to see the value in natural system-based solutions to issues related to water security and climate stability. But we have a few habits we have to overcome. So let's look first to sustainability as a goal. Well, I don't think I need to tell anybody in this room that the first thing we need to know when we climb a steep hill is where the summit lies. The second is that there are no completely painless way for everybody to reach that summit. So failing to know these things may lead all up a deceptively easy path that never reaches the top, but instead meanders off into dead ends, frustrating climbers while at the same time exhausting them of energy and time. And the first deceptively easy path we took that led to a dead end in this country in terms of sustainability was the one that allowed us to stray off the path of environmental protection onto the path of environmental assurance. And in the heyday of North America's international reputation for leading edge environmental governments, governments at all levels were driven by a desire to literally preserve natural system function. But by the 1980s, this principle of environmental protection was superseded by the notion of environmental assurance. And under the banner of environmental assurance, the object came to mitigate environmental impacts rather than prevent them. Instead of providing protection to natural systems, we created markets and industries that mitigated rather than eliminated impacts. And the best way to reverse the damage we created and to end this era is to construct a business model that respects the real value of aquatic ecosystem services rather than simply creating markets for repairing the uncalculated and often uncalculable damage we do to them as a matter of authorized course. So now that's happening here. There's a growing recognition, and boy, I sure learned this last year when I was here. There's a growing recognition that so-called green infrastructure and ecosystem services that they provide can be more effective and less expensive water management solutions than traditional engineering. And the example I have used since I was here last, that I've used around the world, is what's happening in and around what has happened with the success of Gibson's, which I consider to be a model. The second wrong turn we took was taking a permissive view of what sustainable development actually means. You know, and I understand this, I'm Canadian, although forgive me, I'm from Alberta, but I'm still a Canadian. And, you know, as Canadians, we just don't like to offend one another. So as a consequence, you may remember that it became very easy to allow sustainable development to mean pretty much anything you wanted it to be. And this is a path to nowhere. And sustainable development has been introduced in a lot of ways. And but the most frequently quoted definition is from Our Common Future, also known as the Brundtland Report. And that definition goes as follows. Sustainable development is development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Now, what we found is our situation at the moment is that in so substantially altering the fundamental composition of the global atmosphere, we have generated effects and impacts that are cascading through all of nature. And we've literally altered Earth system function to such an extent that if we're not careful now, the world future generations will be inheriting could be unlike the world any human has ever known. So fulfilling the promise of meeting the needs of our generation without compromising the ability of future generation to meet their own needs appears at the moment to be no longer possible. And at this moment in time, there's no guarantee that we can offer that even we, let alone they, will be able to meet their own needs in these altered conditions, let alone meet the needs of their children. And this is what this means. And this is why tomorrow's conference is important. This means that we must first, and to a very real extent, restore the world as we've known it before we can begin fulfilling the terms of Brundtland's definition of what it means to be sustainable. We literally have to go back to go forward again. And that's what tomorrow's symposium is about. We have at last a comprehensive definition of what sustainable development really means and embraces. And we have, for the first time also, a firm timetable for achieving sustainability globally. Sustainable development, as defined by the Transforming Our World agenda, makes it clear that unless we all take the same common goals seriously and implement meaningful and measurable actions at the national level in every country in the world now, we will not achieve sustainability globally. This means there can be no laggards, particularly in the developed world. It also means that the world cannot afford to leave anyone behind. The third wrong term we took, and I think and to some extent still take, is celebrating planning overdoing and confusing aspiration with action. And we have to recognize, I think particularly in this country, that as critical as they are, and as much pride as we should take in them, that pilot projects, voluntary best practice, and unrealized plans to change our habits cannot be used to represent what the status is now in our country. They matter certainly, in that they're the beginning, but they in themselves at the moment do not yet represent our reality. There is a huge gap between promise and practice in our country that needs to be filled. The true measure of our sustainability will be how much and how quickly we can scale up successful pilot projects and good ideas so they can become the norm and not the exception. And this should not discourage us. What the loss of hydroclimatic stability tells us is that true sustainability might be beyond our grasp if we don't do the right thing now. And I believe firmly that if only out of sheer necessity, we are going to do it. We're going to adapt and become more resilient as a society. But I think we need to think about doing more. I think we need to be thinking about more than adaptation in service of resilience. Because resilience to me implies protecting what we have now. We want to be resilient. I think we need to be presilient. We need to protect what we have, certainly, but more than that, we need to adapt now for what is to come. And what I'm saying is that to be sustainable, development in the future must not only be environmentally neutral, it must be both restorative and presilient. And here it is, I'm going to say it. At present, I believe that we have to be presilient to the extent that we anticipate a world 4 degrees warmer than one in which we now live. So, where's the hope? Well, first of all, it's not all bad news. I've given you what the science says, but I've also want to show you where the science is going. We have learned more than we've ever known about the global hydrologic cycle and the functioning of the Earth system in the past 20 years than we have in all of human history. And what we have witnessed, all of us, over the course of the last decade appears to be nothing less than a revolution in what we know. The growing accuracy of data, expanded understanding of Earth system function, greater knowledge and emerging common urgency are literally driving a revolution in the earth sciences. Multispectral, space-based remote sensing is making the invisible visible. Combined with careful terrestrial ground truthing, what was once thought to be impossible may now be possible. The absolute holy grail of hydrologic sciences appears to be within our collective grasp. Because of the work of research groups like the Global Water Futures program here in Canada, integrated flood and drought prediction and forecasting and much, much more may soon be possible. But also we warn scientists that breakthroughs are not enough. World Water Day also underscored the need for science to do a much better job of understandably conveying the outcomes of this kind of research in a timely way to leaders and the public. What the Transforming Our World agenda suggests is that we have to view development in a new light. Hope resides there. I really do believe it does. In order to gain even partial reign over accelerating hydroclimatic cycles, we know now that we have to enlist all the help that nature can provide us, which means restoring the things that mean often the most to us anyway. And as we'll see tomorrow, there's great power in realizing this. And the power resides in this, because it's at the local level where we live that we have the most power to affect change and to act most effectively in service of where and how we live and who we love now and in the future. And perhaps as part of the new narrative we may want to create in support of our planetary future, our message should be that if you really do care about your children, about fairness and reciprocity in our time and intergenerationally, if you don't want to undermine family ties and other inherent loyalties, if you really don't want climate disasters or the threat of Earth system decline to darken our collective hopes for the future, if prosperity really matters, then can we not agree that science can help us? Might we also agree that instead of ignoring our disrupting climate, that while there's still time, there might be an opportunity to use this bottleneck in human existence to create a better future for ourselves, for our children, and for the world. In closing, the question I'm often asked is this: what can I do? I'm just one person. Well, as it happens, there's a lot one person can do in the context of where and how they live. So there's no need to throw up one's hands in helpless despair. Obviously, you can start by reducing your personal carbon footprint, but there are other actions also that are not only helpful, but that can also be personally satisfying and life enriching. You can make where you live, your yard, your property, your neighborhood, your community and its surroundings as natural and beautiful as you can make them. Restore the air and the water, and do so in a way that quietly and without fanfare makes you an example that inspires others to do the same. Start where you live, where you have the greatest power to affect change, and work outward from there. Be what you want to see. That's what one person can do. And if that's not enough, stop being one person. Join others with similar aspirations. And I think that what's really important here is to recognize that there's no downside to this. When you get over the immediate challenges, the long-term benefits of addressing climate disruption, we've lost our, it'll come back up. Okay, what's really interesting, there's no downsides to this, because what you see is when you look at these long-term challenges, the benefits of addressing climate disruption are very clear. There is economic opportunity and quality of life rewards in restoring damaged landscapes. You live in a more pleasant community. There's benefits in upgrading and refining infrastructure, developing and adopting new technologies, and sharing what we know profitably with others in other provinces and around the world. There's an opportunity before us to create a cleaner, healthier, better world now and in the future. What's wrong with that? And the UN has created a perfect vehicle for advancing these aims. The huge opportunity presented itself on the public stage on World Water Day this year with the announcement of the second United Nations Decade of Action on the Global Water Crisis, which will be built around the theme of water for sustainable development. The world will have 10 years under this program for all to work in support of creating a safe operating space for humanity so that we can continue to ensure the stability of planetary conditions that we live in now and want to have in the future. And in my mind, this is an opportunity for British Columbia to really shine. And I know that there are people in this room who have traveled a great deal. And you will know that we are fortunate beyond imagination here. Unlike many other places in the world, Canada, and British Columbia in particular, are still in a position to make sustainability possible. There's real opportunity here that doesn't exist widely, and I can tell you this by my travels, it doesn't exist widely elsewhere. Living on this coast, you understand. There we go. You understand that our society is powered by petroleum and lubricated by oil, but it floats on water. And our society is a vessel in its own right. It's a lifeboat carrying us all over water toward the future. And in my mind, it's impossible to think of a boat carrying societies into the future without thinking of Bill Reid's famous black canoe. The black canoe is nothing less than a Haida ark, the complete physical reality and spiritual universe of an entire people in one boat in which everyone and everything paddles together toward the future. The black canoe is a magnificent metaphor for British Columbia at large and an inspiration for the rest of the world. In addition to spectacular natural landscapes, British Columbia possesses remarkably vibrant indigenous cultures. Few places in the world are as rich in traditional and local knowledge and in possession of such a deep sense of place. Few people care as much about where they live as you do. The opportunity still exists here for everyone to get into the closest thing they can create that resembles the black canoe. And along with all the animals and the rest of creation, paddle together toward the great promise of living in and sharing with others a province that you yourselves once deemed with considerable justification the best place on earth. And I urge you to possess that vision now and always, and I wish you also to consider that such is the hard work of hope in our time. Thank you very much.